Hello and welcome to the Oxford German Classic podcast. My name is Santhia Velasco Kittlaus. I'm a graduate student in the Subfaculty for German here at Oxford and the coordinator for this year's Oxford German Classic essay competition. I'm very happy to host today's podcast to introduce you to our text for this year, which is Der Heizer or The Stoker by Franz Kafka. It is the beginning of a story about 17-year-old Karl Rossmann, who is sent to America on his own by his parents, and he arrives there by ship in New York Harbor, where he also meets the ship's stoker. And I'm very happy to have Dr. Karolina Watroba with me here today, who's a fellow at All Souls College and an expert on Kafka. Thank you for your time and for joining me here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself before we dive into the conversation about Kafka, such as whereabouts you're from, how long you've been at Oxford, and what your current research is about?
So I grew up in Poland and moved here to Oxford to do my undergraduate degree. And I really enjoyed studying here, being here. And so I stayed on to complete my graduate studies here as well. And now I work as a researcher still in Oxford. And my work at the moment actually is mainly on Franz Kafka. I am working on a book which will be out next year, the centenary of Kafka's death. And I am particularly interested in Kafka's cultural afterlives. So how readers around the world over the last century have encountered, read, interpreted, adapted, and responded to his works.
Wow. We will come back to that in a second, as I think it really relates to this text as well. But before we go there, I'd like to ask you, what is it that makes Kafka so interesting for you? What is it that brings you back to reading Kafka?
So Kafka is actually one of the first authors who I read in the original German. And I was struck by both the plotting of his stories and, how those very unusual, unsettling events are described and narrated in this very matter-of-fact, very detailed and precise way. But I think the reason why I keep coming back really has to do with the subject of my book, which is he is one of those iconic authors of the 20th century who have gone on to become real cultural icons. And I just keep seeing him discussed by so many different people in so many different places, in so many different contexts. And that doesn't often happen with German modernist writers. So I guess the ultimate reason why I keep coming back to him is actually to try and understand what it is about Kafka that appeals to so many different people in so many different ways.
So you would say that he is someone whose work appeals to people from different cultures. Why is that? Or is there something that you discovered, if you can talk about that before the publication of your book, that is, that people find interesting about Kafka, or something people from different cultures share or backgrounds share in their approaches to Kafka?
So there are many different ways to answer this question. I think thinking about perhaps also our text for today, what is particularly relevant here is that Kafka's own background was very multicultural. I don't think it's the term that he would have used to describe just the lived reality of his life. But what people also at the time already thought of as separate cultural communities or separate cultural identities, he actually combined a lot of them. So he was Jewish, he was German in the sense that he used German and would somehow sort of identified with Germanness in this sort of non-national definition as a broader sort of identity that isn't confined to a nation state. But at the same time, he also died a citizen of the Czechoslovak Republic. He spoke Czech fluently. He had lots of Czech colleagues, lovers, and was actually interested in Czech culture throughout his life. He also learned Hebrew to quite an advanced level. He was fascinated by Yiddish. He also traveled in other places around Europe and actually, had at least a smattering of other languages like Italian, for example. And then he was also interested in reading about other cultures, imagining other places. We have a perfect example of that here because he never went to America himself. And he wasn't just thinking about America, but also about Asia, about Africa. And he wasn't just sort of setting his stories there, but actually reading, for example, Chinese poetry. One of his favorite poetry anthologies was an anthology of translated Chinese poetry. So he had this sort of openness about the world. And I think also a lot of sensitivity to both the excitement and promise that kind of cultural richness and diversity could bring, but also a very keen understanding of the tensions and the different hierarchies and also oppression and prejudice that come with that kind of diversity and multiplicity.
Which then shows why he can describe Karl's story, to come back to Karl and his behavior as it is, and all the tensions that happen to him, and that he experiences. As in the Heizer, we follow his inner experience to a certain extent, and it changes quite a lot. But it is this being displaced really as he is by his parents for being seduced by this woman or getting her pregnant, the maid, in his parents' house. So he has to go. It's not something that he planned to do. And then he encounters the foreign on that very ship. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so actually, even just rereading this story now in preparation for our conversation, I was really struck by the interplay between the familiar and the foreign, and how they actually are not always assigned to the obvious places and people that we would assume. So, of course, this whole arrival in the harbor of New York is framed as this encounter with foreignness. Karl is observing this new landscape, all those ships, all the machinery.
And it's quite exciting at the
beginning.
beginning.
Yeah. So you would think, okay, so this is the foreignness that he encounters, and all those people on the ship who come with him, they also have come from Europe. So this is the familiar world, and here's the new world. But this is just the starting point, and actually what the story shows is that already back home on the old continent, Karl already there was surrounded by what he perceives as foreignness. And those tensions and relationships are already in place before he reaches this new country. So he describes many of the people he met on the ship on the way to America as foreigners. He specifically sort of specifies the nationality or ethnicity of several of those people. So does the stoker. So they too identify themselves as the non-foreign element. So they are the Germans, and then everything else is foreign. It is interesting that the two nationalities or ethnicities that they pick up on are Romanian and Slovak, because they have historically occupied actually a very complex position in relation to Germanness. So, for example, Kafka himself was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which actually had many Slovak and Romanian citizens. Those were some of the biggest ethnic groups within the empire. So there is this, I suppose, like a nested vision of foreignness, that actually it's never just, the home and the foreign, but actually there are different gradations, and there are those sort of relationships going in different directions. And once you start reading the story with this in mind, I think you start noticing this foreignness almost everywhere. I was struck rereading it now that actually the way that Karl describes this maid who supposedly seduced him, the female body and the femininity and womanhood, that clearly also he sees as completely foreign.
And he's overwhelmed by it. Yeah.
Very overwhelmed by it. That sort of doesn't know how to interact with it. And then, so we have sort of nationality, ethnicity, we have gender, and then we also have class. And here again, nothing is as simple as it appears to be, right? So it's not just the question of some people on the ship are sort of middle or upper class, some people are working class. No, it sort of changes. It's the flexible relationship, and Kafka actually captures it very sort of cunningly by actually having the whole story towards the end morph into a story of recognition, where Karl actually realizes that he now has this really rich uncle who's a senator, who is, sort of on top of the social hierarchy on the ship. And that also means that Karl's own hierarchy changes, and he becomes conscious of it. Everybody else around him, including the stoker, become conscious of it. So also identity isn't something stable, but something that is constantly shifting.
Also for Karl on his journey, as at one point in the story, he thinks about the stoker, mit dem Mann ist schwer zu reden, which kind of tells his own past, how he was educated, where he comes from in terms of the social class of his parents, and how he then meets the stoker by chance, really, and doesn't understand him at the beginning, and then develops this little friendship he has with him, which he has to leave in realizing who his uncle is and the responsibilities that come with that, isn't it?
Yes, this is a very interesting question, because there's also a lot of ambiguity that surrounds those kinds of sentences in Kafka. And actually it starts with the very first sentence, where Karl's parents are described as arm, so poor. And Kafka actually himself commented on the use of this word in a letter to his Czech translator and lover, Milena Jaseńska. And he talks about how there's a certain, sort of in this word, there's an ambiguity. Are we to understand poor as referring to their sort of financial situation, or is it more of, the sort of empathetic, oh, poor you, And there's a certain ambiguity around it. And I guess at first we might be assuming that Karl, he has to travel on this part of the ship that is, very tough conditions. But then he has this rich uncle. But also there are those moments, like you were saying about the Heizer, that reveal that he perceives himself as belonging to a different social class. Another one that I was thinking of is when he, interacting with the Heizer, he wants to offer to him the salami that he has in his suitcase, because he recalls how his father would sometimes sort of, not quite bribe, but make sure that the people working for him, sort of agree with him by giving them cigars, right? So you again have this closely observed social hierarchy that Karl sort of comes in and out of throughout the story. And it's partly because of his young age that it's almost like he's still learning how to interact with people and where he fits in. It's partly because of this whole backstory of being banished, of being sort of abandoned by his parents, really. And then I guess there's also something about Karl's personality. This is something that critics have picked up on a lot when discussing both this story and the novel that it then becomes part of. A lot, so that there is something very childlike and naive about Karl.
He's really nice. He's genuinely friendly with others.
Yeah, but also there seems to be some sort of lack of understanding about people's motives, or that he can't quite figure out the stuff, social mechanisms of living together. And I like how actually Kafka pairs it up with his fascination with mechanisms in the more literal sense, how how objects work and how physical mechanisms work. He says on a few occasions that he would like to become an engineer. Oh, wow. And there are many moments in the novel where he actually observes the functioning of a physical mechanism, of a physical object, in a way not dissimilar to how he observes the mechanisms of social interaction when trying to figure out how to exist in this new world, whose rules he doesn't quite understand. And that all starts already on the ship, actually, that pairing of both Karl being constantly drawn to all of those desks or, buttons.
Playing around with them.
Exactly, and looking at all the ships and the machinery, but at the same time also looking at all the people and trying to figure out, okay, this is the captain, how does he interact with the others, who has real power in this room, who do I have to speak to sort of affect change. And he sort of, if we just read the story in itself, it might still look like, he will figure it out. But actually, if you read the whole novel, there's a series of episodes that in their structure are remarkably similar to this first chapter, The Stalker, because Karl is constantly thrown into those situations when he has to figure things out, and he really goes about it with a lot of seriousness and just really trying to figure it out, but never ever succeeding in this. So there's a certain sense of futility that isn't perhaps doesn't come across as strongly in this first chapter, but if we see it as a series of episodes like this, then you see this sort of gradual loss of hope.
Yeah.
This first story, I guess, still comes across as very hopeful in some ways.
Whereas throughout the novel, he literally falls down on the so-called social ladder.
Exactly. Yeah. So this, in many ways, actually, this opening episode is the high point of his new life in America.
Yeah. As at some point he says, well, now that I'm not at home at school anymore, I can actually become a worker, like a stoker, which is this kind of idea of freedom to a certain extent. And then as soon as the uncle appears, he steps back into being the nephew of a very established upper-class man.
Yeah.
So he can move back and forth at the very beginning, but that changes later on.
Yeah, it's also interesting what the stoker actually says in response to that. He says something like, well, I don't think you really intend to become a stoker, but sometimes the surest way to actually become a stoker is to not intend to become one at all, something like that. So it's also this is one of those little moments in the story that almost have this sort of threatening ring to it, right? That actually there are some forces at work that Karl is not in control of, and that things might not go so well for him, that he might not have as much agency as he is hoping for.
Whereas the stoker is a more mature man who's very well aware of his place in society, knows things that Karl doesn't figure out. So you have that hierarchy between them as well.
Yes, it's very striking how the stoker reacts to the revelation that this rich senator is Karl's uncle. He sort of immediately accepts it and sort of, Karl's initial reaction to this revelation is that he sort of asks himself, okay, so how can this new situation benefit the stoker? Because he's still so emotionally invested in the stoker's plight. But the stoker's reaction is that he just completely gives up. He just knows that nothing here will change from that moment on.
Which is experience coming in that Karl again lacks of, I think.
That relationship between the three of them, Karl, the stoker, and the uncle, is very interesting. Karl clearly becomes very attached to the stoker very quickly. It's also quite clear from how this episode is framed that the stoker's situation, that some some supposed act of injustice had occurred to him and nobody is standing up for him, it clearly triggers in Karl the memory of his own perceived injustice of being banished from home. Actually, there's this moment when they are together in the stoker's cabin where Karl is sat on the bed and the stoker just told him, that he feels so mistreated by this Romanian machinist. And to Karl suddenly seems like he's not at all on a ship in an American harbor, but it suddenly feels Heimish. So, home-like, or he just feels like he's back at home. And I think and he's also on a bed while this is happening. And we later find out this whole, backstory of Karl having this very, very negative, almost traumatic, perhaps we could say, memory of his sexual encounter with the maid, which also takes place on a bed, and he has this sensory memory of sort of being on that bed. So it's almost like that moment in the cabin takes him back to what happened to him at home,
because he can relate emotionally in a way.
Even though he doesn't seem to be conscious of that connection, but I think we as readers, if we look at the clues in the narrative, we can see the parallel being established there. So he has this connection to the stoker in that way. Another connection that that they clearly have is this prejudice that they share against,
Yes.
for Karl, it's the Slovak passenger who he constantly suspects of intending to do him harm. For the stoker, it's the Romanian machinist. And the fascinating thing there is that they completely bond over this suspicion of foreigners as they perceive them, while at the same time being worried about themselves being perceived as foreigners and discriminated against as immigrants coming to America. That the irony of that is completely lost on them, and they just band together as Germans
On a German ship.
on a German ship.
That.
Exactly,
Yeah.
they complain about how it is possible that the German ship employs people who are not German, and then those poor Germans are mistreated by all those horrible foreigners. So quite chilling resonance, I think, still today. But at the same time, Karl doesn't question the stoker's story at all. So we as readers, I think, have this moment of, hang on a minute, would be good to hear the other side of the story, what really happened here. Karl never has that moment. He is sort of completely, fully on board with the stoker, fully invested in his story, tries to even coach him up to defend himself as well as possible. Suddenly he completely forgets about himself, his suitcase, his umbrella that he's so worried at the beginning. It's almost like, rather than worrying about his own uncertain future in America, he completely transfers all of this worry and anxiety onto the stoker. And then the uncle comes in and disrupts that dynamic. We've already talked a little bit about how Karl also seems to be in denial initially. He keeps thinking, what does this mean for the stoker? They have all of these sort of slightly forced, this bodily welcome, the shaking of the hands, the kisses. Karl seems to be, completely passive during this welcome with the uncle. And then, of course, it all builds up to that really suddenly, unexpectedly moving and intense farewell scene between Karl and the stoker. As he and the uncle prepare to leave the ship, and ultimately, we sort of leave them on a smaller boat, still not quite on land. And there, Karl cries, breaks into tears, finds it very difficult to part from the stoker. And then this last, the very last sentence, he asks himself, will the uncle ever be able to replace the stoker for me? Yeah. Which then sort of raises the question, replace as what? Replace in what sense?
Exactly, what is he looking for? And at the same time, what does it suggest about his further story?
Exactly. Yeah. So it shows that Karl looks for ways to slot into some pre-existing patterns that he sees himself as existing in relation to other people, but to a quite extreme degree, right? That it seems almost that he is unable to sort of function independently. Both are, of course, older men, older than him, so we could think authority figures. But actually with the stoker, it is much more complex because Karl, to the stoker, Karl seems to be in a position of authority, sort of representing his case in front of the captain, and then is the nephew of this rich senator. Whereas with the uncle, he's both a family member, but also really actually ein Fremder, we would say in German, which literally means, could mean a foreigner, but also could mean, somebody I don't know. In a way, he is a foreigner to Karl because he identifies as an American now. He has changed his name. There's also this other strange connection that we find out, that the uncle has found out from the maid, Johanna, that she actually named her son with Karl, Jakob, to actually as an homage, in a way, to the uncle. So there's this strange sort of net of connections that isn't quite, explained to us. There's something something not right about it, the change of the name, the fact that Karl at first, says, but wait a minute, you can't be my uncle because it's not the right name. The fact that the uncle, to recognize Karl, has to consult his notes on, what is he supposed to look like, this nephew of mine. So this whole recognition scene, in a way, feels very, there isn't a feeling of trust.
Yeah.
It's more against of slotting into pre-existing positions. Yeah. The uncle thinks, okay, I have a nephew. Who is the nephew? And Karl sort of then comes to occupy this position. So it's again this sense of a pre-existing pattern into which Karl is supposed to just slot into, rather than some sort of pre-existing familial, a warm connection.
So Karl doesn't really have an agency on his own, right?
Yeah. And one way to track it through the story is to look at how Karl is described. So the first time we meet him, he's Karl Rossmann. So it's, his name, he's introduced to us. But then actually, as the story progresses, I noticed that he often actually is not referred to by his own name, but for example, as the senator's nephew. Or, there are all those other descriptors.
So he loses his identity step by step.
Yeah, or just this identity shifts, in ways that, again, seem counterintuitive, because you would think that to be somebody's nephew is not really an identity you can just sort of take up. It's something that you're born into. So it feels somehow unnatural or artificial to sort of take it up in this way. Another way another detail where I think it comes up in an interesting way is when Karl and the stoker enter the captain's room, and to identify himself, Karl doesn't actually say who he is, but he takes out his passport and just puts it at the desk, on the desk, and then the official who is supposed to deal with it just sort of moves it aside. So and Karl puts it stuff back in. So it's almost as identity is really not something. It's not who you are, but it's some sort of like a formality that it's something that is in your passport, or it's something that somebody assigns to you based on the notes he'd made, looking at some letters that he'd received from somebody. So it's not. So it's this strange mismatch between how we usually think about identity, that it's something sort of innermost to you, and how those identities actually shift and are assigned to people in the story. And it all happens, in the context of all those immigrants arriving in America. So it's also thematized on that level, that these are all people who are sort of coming here to become somebody else. A little detail that comes to mind here is when Karl is so suspicious of this Slovak passenger that he keeps staying awake at night to observe him. And we're told that he can observe him more easily because people constantly put on the light to look in the immigration guides that they carry with them. So clearly, everybody there is preoccupied with this notion that once you step off that ship, you become somebody else. You have to take up a new identity. And that's sort of almost carried to the extreme in Karl's own story, who sort of juggles these different identities actually even before he steps off that ship.
Yeah. And Kafka explains through this story, through Karl's story, or shows really how unreliable these labels are that we cling to in thinking who we are and who we're not in terms of having an identity as opposed to the other.
Exactly. Yeah, so I think the story captures really well that sort of relational nature of identity, how we are somebody in relation to other people, and those can shift and change. And in this story, they happen to sort of change like that, every moment. And I think what is so interesting in how Kafka plots it out in this story is that it's all set against the sort of historical background of a mass migration movement from Europe, and especially from places like Germany and Slovakia and Romania to the United States of America in the early 20th century. So this is a tension often in Kafka, that you have that part of this story is very easy to sort of explain. The general scenario we understand. In a way, it's sort of very factual, what happens to those immigrants when they come. when they come to America. But then the details of what happens and how it plays out has this sort of unsettling effect that things are not, are in a way inexplicable.
Yeah.
You can't quite understand why people behave the way they do, even though the context makes sense, it's sort of familiar. It's not fantastical. But people's motivations and behaviors and relationships, something is off.
It does get quite confusing sometimes, yeah. That is really fascinating, thank you. And to come back to your own research, in terms of how foreigners and identity are displayed here in the Heizer, do you think it is a story that might be interesting for many people from different backgrounds, from more than other stories possibly?
That's a good question. So yes, I think the way it captures the experience of coming into a foreign land and trying to find your way around it, many aspects will be familiar to many people, and the struggle with everything from the struggle with the language. In this story, Karl is very conscious that I don't speak English yet, and then later on in the novel he tries to learn. All the documents and those harbor officials who sort of have to process all the documents, being so far away from home.
Yeah, making mistakes and learning from them.
Exactly. So that's that I think many people can relate to. At the same time, again, the details of how it all pans out often sort of veer into the sort of more fantastical or inexplicable, and it's the mixture of the two that it seems to correspond to very common human experiences, but at the same time there's this certain flavor given to it, or this layer of not quite knowing what is going on or how to explain how things hang together, that I think gives Kafka his characteristic charm and also makes this story, it really pays off to reread it several times. And thinking about this quality is also instructive to think about Kafka's inspiration for writing it. And there are many, but one in particular that I'm thinking of in this context is actually on his travels in 1911, which is one of the first times that actually Kafka goes anywhere outside of Prague for a sort of longer period of time. He encounters a man who is actually a Jewish man from what is now Poland. And he had just come back from America. And Kafka is clearly really fascinated with this character, and he describes him in quite a lot of detail and talks to him, but also describes his appearance, his mannerisms in his speech. And so he encounters somebody who is a bit like Karl, somebody who came from vaguely this part of Europe, who went to America, experienced that. And then soon after, he writes this story. But in the story, this character is transformed into somebody else. So you can see how he takes a common experience at the time that would have been familiar to many people, and to this day, it's one of those sort of, classic human stories of emigration.
And how it changes us.
Yeah. So he takes that, but then puts his own spin on it, puts it into this structure that we've already discussed of a series of episodes, of incidents where Karl comes into different sort of sections of the American society, different types of workplaces, also different locations. Some of them described with quite a lot of factual accuracy. Some of them actually Kafka gets things wrong. Some of them perhaps, just because he hadn't been there himself, he was relying on sort of secondary sources. Sometimes I think quite consciously, to show that this is not the historical, realistic America. I like when often the title of this novel in English is rendered as America written with a K. To sort of, to make clear that this is not America with a C. This is some sort of America with a twist. so he takes this real life person he met and is inspired by their experiences, clearly sort of digested, thinks about it, reads about what America is like, what people's experiences are there, and then connects it with his own imagination as a writer and with lots of themes and motifs that actually remain important to him in his other writing. Again, rereading it very carefully in preparation for this, I was struck by how at one point Karl is compared to Ungeziefer. So this sort of infamous word that is very important to Kafka, which means something like vermin, could mean more specifically insect, was also used as an anti-Semitic slur in Kafka's time. And that word is the key word in the Metamorphosis,
Yes,
Kafka, one of Kafka's most famous stories. Another key word that I spotted is when Karl is thinking about the Stoker, and he, when he hears his story, he immediately thinks that somebody must have been telling tales about him, and he uses the verb verleumden, which then comes up in the first sentence of the trial. That somebody must have been telling tales about Josef K. So there's those certain motifs that then sort of become central to Kafka's work that recur a lot across the stories that we can also see in here.
And both Ungeziefer as something somebody might say about you and verleumden as an action comes from the gaze of the other. And it's a certain power hierarchy in these actions.
Yeah,
such,
exactly. Yeah, you're exactly right. And also both belong to this, to I guess the thematic area of sort of injustice and things going awry between people and some sort of conflict or yet interpersonal tension. And those are some of the themes that really are central to Kafka's work.
And also like this feeling of how limited we are sometimes in dealing with injustices.
Yeah.
As we try to do something like Karl, who tries to help, but he can't, not really from his position. And the Stoker realizes, as we said at the beginning, but Karl doesn't.
Yeah.
So that comes back in Kafka.
Yeah, and also this sort of broader, I guess, question that remains to be resolved by the reader, is Stoker even in the right?
Yeah,
and shouldn't Karl be sort of examining it a bit more closely? So the question of responsibility, of guilt, of hierarchies, both within the workplace, also within the family, and the relationships, strained relationships between family members, between genders also. And many of those themes ultimately come back to this perception of what is foreign and sort of the questions of identity and how we relate to other people and how we form alliances, but also how people can be pitted against each other or have those sort of conflicts that are very difficult to resolve because they rest on some sort of deep, uncomfortable assumptions.
Which are timeless structures, really.
Yeah.
So we really can get a lot out of this story, I think.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And for those of you listening or watching us, have a look at our website. You can find the link in the description box below, or just Google Oxford German Classic to find out more about our essay competition for sixth formers. Thank you. Bye and tschüss.
Thank you.